So Tim, one of the beautiful, beautiful things about social media these days, and especially Instagram, is us woodworking enthusiasts watching these professional studio furniture makers building a piece. And it's exciting because it feels like it's real time. Every day you post, you're working on it. And one of the first pieces for me and for the others at Fine Woodworking that really took off with was your Arabesque cabinet. And when we decided to come up here and make some videos with you, I immediately knew that we had to talk about the design and what happened before you started posting on Instagram with it. So, I mean, obviously this is on top. Is this the first iteration, the first drawing that you had?
Yes, I believe it is. The inspiration for the piece stems from my long-time fascination with patterns from around the world, and particularly from the Arab world and Islamic patterns. And a couple of years ago, my wife had a work gig in Istanbul, and I got to come along to carry her bags and see the sights.
You just had to.
I had to, yes. So it was a thrill to go there, and I just loved the city and the Islamic influence and the merging of cultures there. I mean, the city sits both in Europe and Asia. On one side of the Bosphorus Strait is Asia, and the other side is Europe. So you have the confluence of cultures there, and just being able to walk into mosques and just be awestruck by the pattern work and
I mean, literally surrounded by patterns.
Oh yeah,
in the mosque,
yeah.
like that, yeah.
And because there's no iconography, it's all patterns, and just the intricacy, and so I knew I wanted to create a piece that drew heavily from those influences, and so I'd been mulling it over for a while. And the Arabic script, this kind of script, is often used in a kind of pictorial way. It's not always literal alphabet. It can be used as a decorative motif. And so I was, because I didn't want to try to replicate letters and make a faux pas, it didn't seem genuine either. So I was trying to think of ways that I could use those lines of the script in a pattern way. And so these drawings began to emerge. I had a sense of the scale of the piece. Somewhat tall-ish, somewhat narrow piece, and I was playing around with ideas for this base that were kind of parts crossing, curving up, and I often draw with just a Sharpie. I like. Do you
draw here?
Yeah, usually just on the table. I like to use fairly large pieces of paper, and the Sharpie. I can be very free with it, and I can highlight areas by darkening them. I can alter lines very easily, and it doesn't feel as fussy as a pencil, and I can't erase. So,
exactly.
I'm kind of committing in some way.
Yeah.
And also when I was thinking about pattern ideas, using the Sharpie. Was very easy to make bold flowing lines. And so
these are bold flowing lines.
Yes, they are. And so in my mind, I was thinking of this sort of thing covering the whole surface, and whether it was going to be a marquetry technique or something, a fretson where these were open spaces. I wasn't sure. I was just letting things flow pretty freely with that.
What's this? Is this in relation to anything?
Probably. That may have been thinking, oh, maybe I'll do a chest of drawers out of it.
Okay. Yeah.
Honestly, I think that's what I was thinking. And so you can see in these ideas, I'm working with sort of panels, door panels, where I'm really flooding the surfaces with these patterns. But and so, played around a lot more with the density of it. Did these where there's more space between the elements.
And then you've got borders.
Yep, yes, doing some borders. So really just trying to be pretty free. And, to do a drawing like this might take an hour to do this, and this one less time. But all the while, it's letting these thoughts come out onto paper and seeing what might emerge. And honestly, I think I was really trying to get this to work in this broad way, and it just wasn't happening.
Because it was too loud to you think? Or?
Yeah, too. I guess just too much. And maybe it was the scale. Maybe if it were something much smaller, I would have been able to generate the idea and feel good about it. So it wasn't until I shifted and decided that I was going to go. Then I even did this one where the lines are more squiggly and cross each other, and the base becomes much more.
Oh, it's continuing that.
Sort of a prominent feature.
This is interesting. Sorry to pull this out, but you're actually editing yourself at this point.
Right. Yeah. We all are familiar with cutting and pasting. Well, this is literally cutting and pasting. I had another base here, and rather than redraw the whole thing, I just put a piece of paper over it and did that.
Well, and this is kind of where you wound up, right?
It is. So once I moved away from the notion of covering the entire panels with this motif, and went to a border pattern, which there's a number of pieces where I've done decorative borders, somewhat like that. It all of a sudden felt more comfortable, and felt like, okay, now I've got someplace I can go with this. You can see I have another pattern drawn in on the surfaces of the drawers. Initially, I was actually thinking of using a wood that had a lot more character and not having any pattern on it. I had this. This is some Japanese horse chestnut, and it has all these markings in it, and it's got some really nice kind of fiddleback type curl in it. And so I thought, well, that might be kind of interesting to have the body of the cabinet have this kind of more raw, natural character, bordered with these more deliberate patterns, but also the patterns would be natural, flowing. And so I cut up all the veneer for this, but again, it wasn't really working for me. And so I don't recall exactly where I moved in this direction, but while I was cutting this up, I had some really nice bird's eye veneer, and I thought, well, I might use that for the inside. So I'll use the horse chestnut for the outside, and then the inside of the cabinet, you open it up, and it'll be this really nice, bright bird's eye. So having both stacks of veneer, suddenly I felt myself moving more towards the bird's eye, and just being more attracted to the tone of it and the pattern possibilities with that. And then I was looking through some of my photos in Istanbul and looking for more inspiration. And this pattern, which is a tiled pattern I saw in a mosque there, came to the top. And I then started to think about how I could do that in a fairly subtle way, and cover the surfaces with that and have a bordered pattern around the top and bottom.
So at this point, you're still figuring out the border?
That's
or-
right. I felt like at least I had a place to start here that I was feeling good about. And actually, the first thing to do was to think about the scale of the body of the cabinet, so that I could determine what size these square components were going to be. I had a pretty good idea of overall what the scale was going to be, but I had to really dial in on that so that I could begin to get to work, because at this point I hadn't started making it other than cutting up veneer. And I was eager to get into the process of making it, because, as is always the case, a lot of decisions happen once I'm actually making it, but I need a solid place to start.
Yeah.
And so I, in full size, drew this out and determined how big those blocks were going to be. And so then at least I could get started creating those sheets of veneer. And so the doors and then the sides were patterned as well, and the sides were the same as one of the doors.
So you start, because once you start sawing veneers and coming up with these panels, you're going.
Yeah.
You don't do any mock-ups or anything, like actual quarter scale mock-ups, full-size mock-ups. You had mentioned a full-size drawing, which we'll see later, but
it depends. In this case, I was feeling somewhat confident with my dimensions, and I knew that there was going to be a lot of flexibility in the base in terms of the proportions of those parts and exactly how high it was going to be. So I was maintaining some flexibility there, but I felt confident enough to get going with that I didn't need to do a mock-up or a scale model, which in the past I have done that periodically. And I like to get by with as little as possible in the process. Trying to really draw out what my internal vision is and get to it as quickly as possible, and not get too stuck in the model stage or a mock-up, because sometimes those can be a distraction from where it is I want to go. So try to trust as much as possible the instinct, and a lot of that also just comes with experience.
exactly.
So now
You've been
I know,
doing this a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I have a vision in my mind of a volume of a piece, and I have also many, I always go back and look at other pieces I've done and say, okay, how high was that one? How wide was that one? And okay, that's 52 inches. So now I know what that looks like.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of it is just having a experience and a whole back history of pieces. And so then it was a matter of making those panels. I could go as far as building up all those panels, creating each square individually, and then gluing them together, gluing and taping them together. So even though this is essentially a butt joint here across the veneer, it's glued together and it holds together fine, at least as for the duration of before you actually press it on the substrate.
And then when it's on the substrate,
it's together. And so, it's got enough integrity here that you can work, so each one of these panels, I was able to glue together the entire sheet in veneer form before pressing it.
Because really, these panels dictate the size of the whole piece.
They do. Yep. Yep. As far as the body of the cabinet, Again, there's still some flexibility in exactly how wide you make that, but you're, not a lot. That's not going to change the overall dimensions of the cabinet that much.
And so there's obviously some iterations of the border.
Yeah, then when I got to the because of the inspiration for the piece and the Arab script, I was really wanting that to work as in this border pattern, and I had gone from having it, cover the entire surfaces of the cabinet to a border pattern. And while I was somewhat happy with these, it just still wasn't really working for me. It just didn't seem natural enough for what I was doing, and it's hard to explain.
It's beautiful. These are beautiful to look at, but that's a brave thing for you to kind of move on from your initial thought.
Yeah, and I've thought a lot about that, and I've talked to another friend who's a musician and does a lot of original compositions, and talking about initial concepts and what happens with them. Do you stick with that? Sometimes you can be like sticking with it so doggedly, you don't want to give this up because it's what got you there in the first place. And sometimes it can become a hindrance, and you're fighting it because it's you're trying to make it work. So now I've kind of come to a peace with it and think about it in a different way. Is maybe all it is sometimes is your entry into it, and it's served its purpose.
Because you'd have never come up with this form.
That's right.
Without starting with
these,
this.
with those ideas, the pattern ideas, and I wasn't ready to totally turn my back on it because the concepts of the Islamic patterns were still what I wanted to work with, and what I continued to work with. But I started thinking more about a repeating pattern. And I had taken a lot of photos in Istanbul, and also began to explore some other repeating patterns that come from those cultures. And so this was one I thought about, and this one was kind of attractive also, but a little too busy. But I took this one and started eliminating some details in it, simplifying it.
Okay.
And so this becomes this. So you still have, this element, and then this. So it's all
absolutely.
It's all there.
It's just an edit.
And distilling the pattern down to something that that suited the nature of this piece. And as complex as something like this can look, I'm very always trying to keep things as pure as I can.
Take out as many elements as you can without losing your...
And also, because of the techniques I was working with, I knew for this border pattern that what I wanted to do was a marquetry technique, and I wanted there to be layers. As I've done in the past, you have a dark wood pattern with a light underneath, and so that dark wood has a shadow line around it because the light wood is recessed. Or I wanted to bump out the dark wood, which is what I did in the end. So it's marquetry, but the dark elements are actually raised slightly from the surface. And so I was trying to come up with a simplified way of doing a pattern like this.
So this wound up being the final pattern?
Yep. And it's just, this is well, I mean, basically that's the
Mhm.
that's your pattern, and it's
Mirrored
flipped.
and then
Yeah.
repeated.
But I consider this to be the
Yeah.
pattern. And then just refining it a little bit more, and because there's still a lot of subtleties
Mm-hmm.
to it.
Yeah, I see you're still editing on this one. And here they're actually meeting, and wow. Okay.
Mhm. And because we have a fixed dimension here, also have to, with a repeating pattern, because I went away from something that was more random to fill that space, we're going with a repeating pattern.
This repeating pattern had to line up with this repeating pattern in the end, right?
That's right.
Ah, there's where your math problem starts coming in.
Well, yeah, math. Actually, it's there's always a little bit of flexibility there. When I was talking about you were here, I actually connected these, so you can see here now.
Yeah.
I've actually connected them, and I've added another element back in. So the spacing here, you can vary that slightly, but overall you need to create these elements in such a way so that the pattern works out across the width of the piece.
Well, let's go look at the finished item.
Sure.
Here we go. This is it. Arabesque. This is
Off
incredible.
the drawing board.
Yeah, and behind, if you guys can see, behind we have the full-size sketch, which you have admitted to editing as you go.
Yes, in fact, this is more of a record of the piece.
Okay.
Because so many little changes happened along the way. Dimensional changes, the width of this pattern or this border, how thick this is, the scale of the base, the height of the base. That I brought that up a whole inch at one point. So this drawing ended up there had been another drawing with lots of edits on it, and I have that. But this was to have a record, a precise record of it.
And we've got these incredible frets on. What do you call that?
Yep.
Fretwork right there. Scrolls on. The backing to these poles. These poles don't look off the shelf.
It's surprising. They were polished brass ring poles that you can get from any number of catalogs. I bought a bunch years ago. I was doing another cabinet with some ring pulls, and I had moved away from a central circular medallion type thing in the middle here, and in an effort to simplify, and also once this pattern was so dominant here, I didn't want to do something that was going to really interrupt that too much. So things started to move in this direction. And these polished brass pulls, really bright, shiny, that on their own would have looked horrible here. But I took them through a patina process. I stripped the finish and the polish off, and then used a torch and heated them up. So it's like a heat patina, because it changes the metal just a little bit to give it a patina. And then I also used a liquid patina formula that added a little bit of green to it.
Did you do the same on the hinges?
I didn't. Those were also this brightly polished brass, and those I just I used lacquer thinner to get the lacquer finish off of them, and then fine sandpaper and sanded it back to kind of a matte finish, and they've taken on somewhat of the same character as the ring pulls.
This cove up here that is including this top veneer is just, I mean, it's just one of those touches that the fact that cove extends through the two pieces, just incredible to me. It just while we were talking off camera, every surface, every inch of this piece is very deliberate and intentional, thought about. Even you had mentioned earlier that inside you were going to use the bird's eye maple for originally. I was wondering if the chestnut had found its way inside.
I know. Yeah, I decided to just, because this bird's eye is particularly nice, the two shelves, I ran out of the bird's eye from one board, which one board covers all these surfaces and all the interior with the exception of these two shelves. But it's really lovely bird's eye. It's not so bird's eye-y.
Yeah.
Which sometimes bird's eye maple, the bird's eyes can be darker and really prominent. This has a much softer, more subtle effect.
The mitered corner to the case and the door with the hinges on it. I've never seen that before. I'm sure.
Well, it's not easy.
No.
I wanted the pattern to be uninterrupted at the corner, and there's not a lot of ways you can do that without having it come together at a miter like that. The problem is with, and I thought about using, I loved knife hinges, and I in some ways I would have loved knife hinge here, just for a little more unobtrusive hinging possibility. But it would have required a custom-made hinge, and I didn't have the foresight and the time to have something custom-made. But I was able to find these hinges, and the thing about these hinges which really works for this is the offset of the screws. The one in the center, because you don't have much to screw into here. The further you're going out here,
wow, yeah.
it gets, it gets really
if the
thin.
screw holes were too far. Wow.
Right. So these hinges, fortunately, were the right size, and having these screw holes set so far in gave me enough meat to screw into there. And this one, I just had to use a little bit shorter screw.
Wow.
And you're talking about this this detail. One thing I love is when techniques are also really simple to execute, and this is surprisingly easy to execute in terms of building up this whole surface. I mean, basically, I've got a plywood panel that's edged with the walnut that comes together at a miter, and then I just plop this sheet of veneer right on it, glue it on.
So you do your edging and then veneer the whole thing.
And veneer the whole thing. And then, and to make the veneer, you can make it go all the way out to the edges here in its raw form. And then you square everything up. You can do this profile, and then you do this profile, and it just trims everything back, because then you're working off of this, this face as your reference. And it takes advantage of the fact that I'm using thick veneer, because you see that element.
Yeah.
You see the thickness there. And there's a lot of subtleties as far as how deep do you make that cove? How much do you overhang? There are a lot of little subtleties in there that need to be carefully thought out.
Wow. Well, it was great watching this piece happen. If anyone watching this is curious, you can go to your Instagram feed. You just search for Tim Coleman.
Coleman Furniture. Yeah.
And you can scroll through and watch this piece be born, and hopefully there will be more there. And this is just it's awesome to see the design process begin and to see the finished piece. So thank you so much for showing it to us.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a lot of fun to share it with you, and to share it with everybody on Instagram. It was a unique experience for me, and something I will certainly continue to do.